The project that we have been doing in the lower mainland here in Vancouver is one of establishing identity. Identity is currency. Identity is a currency that we use to communicate with other people. It's the first thing that people perceive. So when we talk about stereotypes, that is the identity that people automatically take from you. So our project has been working on, in the last 4 years, establishing a positive identity, a strong, healthy identity for the mainstream. There is a problem, I feel, with the mainstream's recognition of the Punjabi community, of the Sikh identity in Canada, something that I feel more acutely maybe because I'm originally from the UK and we don't have the same problems in the UK as there are problems with identity in Canada. So at the center of this is that I believe there is a corruption of identity. So the Sikh Qaum's identity has been corrupted by certain powers, institutions in Canada, so that it has a negative effect on the community moving forward. Essentially, that's the crux of the project. What we do is we use the First World War, the ਪਹਿਲੀ ਜੰਗ ਸੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੀ, ਉਸ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਰਵਿਸ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਬਹਾਦਰੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਦਿਖਾਈ ਆ, we use those stories to develop a positive identity so that our children can pick those stories up, so that the mainstream can pick those stories up. Why is it important to have a strong identity? Well, in the absence of a strong identity, a negative identity feeds this cycle of intolerance, discrimination, fear, which ultimately becomes distrust between parties. The mainstream does not trust you, you do not trust the mainstream to do the right thing by the community. So we see that play out every day when negative identities are given, not a positive identity. So if there's a criminal element in the news, they will make sure that they identify that it's an Indo-Canadian, but when it is a Caucasian criminal, they never identify which part of Europe those people are from. So we see that this plays out all day. You may not even notice it, you may just think it's automatic, but to outsiders, to me, I see it. And I think that's what creates problems for communities that have been here even longer. The Aboriginal community, once you have a negative identity, they become more insular, they have more issues, social issues, because the mainstream cannot connect with them. And you see other communities like the black community also having these issues of negative identities, which creates a divide, creates mistrust. And ultimately our children are the ones that suffer from that negative identity that's passed on. So, is this a big deal? Of course it's a big deal. I'm sure you understand this. I'm sure you understand that Sikhism in Canada is not looked upon favourably. I know you don't like it, but that's the fact. And that's why efforts have to be made to correct the identity in the mainstream. So when I see a headline in national newspapers that says Islam scored the lowest favourable rating, just at 28%, Sikhism didn't fare much better? How is Islam and Sikhism categorized in one group, right at the bottom of people's perceptions of acceptability? Where has that come from? Those are frightening statistics. That one was a few years ago, a decade ago, 2009. It's getting worse. Now, only 13% of Canadians look upon Sikhism in a favourable way. So, you have to think about that this is the environment your children are walking into. So, Anytime your children take a job and they leave South Vancouver or Surrey and they go out to Canada, where people may not know who the community is, the stereotype or the perception of the community is what is going to greet them. So it's a huge problem, and it's going from bad to worse. These are national newspapers. They're not what we call, the funny tabloids. These are serious newspapers in Canada. So what does that kind of intolerance, misunderstanding, negative identity, what does it actually result in? Well, it results in hostility. So now this is very current. And this, for a community that's been in Canada for 100 years, is so misunderstood. How does that come about? It's so misunderstood at a cultural level, a religious level, at a cultural level, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter politically where you are. Everyone, they're talking about as long as we don't have to join your culture. In other words, there's a divide. Canada is legally a multicultural country. But there are divides. So, an example that I use, a friend of mine, a few years ago went to a restaurant in Langley, and they didn't allow him and his wife and his friend in. The Gorek didn't allow him in. And he filed a case. And the laws are there. So for an infringement of his dignity, he won $10,000 compensation for this bar not allowing him and his friend in because they discriminated against him on the basis of his color. So the laws are there. It is a multicultural country on the basis of law since the 1970s. But is it in practice? If he got that through the system, the law worked. But what about the dignity, his dignity for one evening? Going in and enjoying himself was worth $10,000 compensation? What about the dignity of the whole community that has served mankind with nothing but a philosophy of service to mankind, wherever they have been, and you treat them this way in the press, you treat them this way in the news, you treat them this way in education, in heritage? Should there not be then a case for defamation or infringement on your dignity at the community level? So these are kind of things that I think about, and I believe that this cycle, the vicious cycle that keeps going round and round and round, more distrust means that people fear you more, become more intolerant of you. As you become more intolerant, then people become more discriminatory against you. We don't want to give an Indo-Canadian a job. We don't want an Indo-Canadian coming into the restaurant. We don't want them here. All that keeps going on, and then ultimately what happens is the youth will say, we don't want to go to those restaurants. Or they'll lash out and so forth. And then you start to build antisocial attitudes. That's what's happened to the black community over the years. They become antisocial themselves. And this keeps going, and then people become more insular. So that means, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to live in Langley because they're racist there. I'm not going to live in Chilliwack, they're racist there. I'm not going to live in Red Deer, Alberta because they're racist there. So then the community becomes more insular. And it feeds again and again and again. It keeps going around. And it all starts from there. So what is the thing that's been catalyzing this? What's been driving this? What gives it the energy? What gives it the momentum? And first of all, it's the government, the Canadian government. Even though laws are there, in policy, practice is different. Then the heritage institutions of Canada. Then the education systems of Canada. And finally the media. These are all mainstream key institutions in Canadian society. And each one of them has had or catalyzed this cycle. That's how I see it. And as I said, maybe I see it more acutely because I'm from outside and I've stepped into this, but I know in the UK that the Sikh community is not labelled this way. So this cycle, what do you do about this cycle? And as we say, you have to identify the source of the problem. And unfortunately for us, the source of the problem goes all the way back to the government. And what you see there, obviously going back 100 years ago, there are exclusionary laws that were put into place. But then, that's the source of a negative identity. And I'll go into really quickly why they were put into place. But now you start to see, okay, well, they didn't just turn up from mid-air, out of thin air. They were creative, and the government created these. So initially, what was the identity of Canadians at the very birth of Canada? What was the Sikh identity in Canada? Well, the first Prime Minister of Canada spoke of them in terms of their gallantry and their bravery. So, where did that bravery come from? Well, when the British first met the Sikhs in the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the kind of reports that were going back to Britain about the Sikhs as an enemy were of their courage and valour. Courage and valour are universally admired. Strength is universally admired. These are positive attributes. This is a positive identity. You are extolling positive virtues on people. There's nothing, so that's what was in place from the 1850s onwards. So when Canada in 1867 became a nation, that was the identity of the Sikhs across the empire. And how did this go across the empire? How did someone in Canada know about the bravery of the Sikhs? That to such an extent the first Prime Minister would say, well, if America causes us a problem by encroaching on the East Coast, by trying to take Montreal, we will send in the Sikhs to take San Francisco from America. How does that happen? Well, a moment in history was when, that was pivotal in the identity, was when Queen Victoria gave her proclamation, which many people consider the Magna Carta of India, the rights of Indians under empire. And she was very she had a pro-liberal stance. I don't know if anyone's seen Victorian Abdul, the new movie. You can see that she had an affinity to Indian people. She knew how to speak Urdu, Hindi, she could write, and she was very affectionate of her Sikhs. Now we know there's different political perspectives on that. She obviously knew who the Sikhs were. Dalit was adopted into the household. So there was not a mistaken identity. She knew exactly who everyone was in India. And at that point in time, the proclamation in the empire was, whatever skills and education you have, we're going to open up employment to you. You can have jobs in our administration of empire. And so if you're a minority, this is a huge social upward force. It's social mobility. I can get a job, and it doesn't matter if I'm a Brahmin or not. It doesn't matter. I can find a job in the civil service. But what were the Sikhs good at? What were they famous for? Their martial heritage, as I just mentioned. So it was only natural that the largest employer in India, which was the Defence Department, which spent 50% of India's budget on the military, would be an attractive employer. Now, just like the Scots, the Sikhs were also then not allowed, once the kingdom had been annexed into Punjab, the Sikhs were also not allowed to have a Khalsa army anymore. The Khalsa army had been defeated. So, to bear arms and to be a professional soldier would be under the British flag. Just like the Scots, they weren't allowed. Once Scotland had been annexed, they weren't allowed to use their martial valour independently. So it's a case of appropriation of martial heritage, if you want. You can look at it that way, or you can look at it, well, I need a job. The best employer at the moment that's paying the best wages is the military, and I live in the Doaba and I've got nothing much to do, land is short, so I'm going to join the military. That was the kind of thinking that was going on. Land is short, we need to find employment, and the Crown was saying, well, you are the bravest soldiers in India, we want you. So that's how employment starts within, and the relationship starts with the British. Now, those soldiers that were tremendously brave, and the British understood them to be tremendously brave, were very quickly became an international force on campaigns throughout the globe. So starting with 1860, after coming under the Crown, the first Punjabi regiments went out to China. And then after that, they went out to Abyssinia in 1867, and they fought in Egypt at the Suez. And each time they built a reputation for themselves for being not only fearless soldiers, but humane soldiers. And that's what made the Khalsa soldier the ideal for the British. Because the humanity behind the Khalsa soldier, to be brave, ferocious in battle, but also to be benevolent in victory, to be humane in victory, that made it the ideal soldier. And so even more money was put into the Punjab. So we had a situation where it was equivalent of Ottawa spending half of their defence department's budget in a Esquimalt on the island. Can you imagine how many jobs would open up, what the roads would be like, how much infrastructure would be developed? And Punjab became a garrison for the whole empire because the favoured soldiers, initially before the Sikh Empire was annexed, were the Muslimans, the Nawabs. Those princely states were initially, and the Brahmins were the favoured soldiers, but a policy was put into place where they were all thrown out and the Sikhs were asked to join, and they were favoured. So, with all these campaigns running up to the eve, if we know these dates, this is about the time that Punjabis started to come to Canada. So we have now 50 years, 40 years of service already under the Crown, for the flag, for the monarch, throughout the world. And now you have an identity. And that identity is one that Lord Kitchener describes as priceless to the empire. So you have brave, gallant, priceless people. Kitchener, who's in charge of the whole First World War effort, he describes this scenario when in Somaliland the Sikh soldiers, rather than surrendering, would fight to the death. And in military circles, that is respected. Now, what you have to remember, they use a term called martial races to define the people of India. And the Sikhs were right at the top of that definition, and then the people of the south were at the bottom. But they looked upon themselves as the greatest martial race of them all, because they had the biggest empire on the planet, the biggest empire in history. So, we're a martial race. You guys, we kind of understand who you are, and we like what you're doing. So, let's build this alliance. Now, that alliance was there because the Sikhs and the British had a common enemy. Now, a common enemy is always a good basis for an alliance. And that was the Afghans. The Afghans were the nemesis of the Sikhs. All the Turcos from the north, up in the northwest frontier, were the nemesis of the Sikhs. And for the British, they were the nemesis because in 1842 the British were defeated. In their first battle with the Afghans. So now you have a group of people, you appropriate their martial heritage, you provide employment, and they actually go and do the job, and they've got a positive identity. That identity then carries through the other colonies where they are now favoured. In fact, in the Far East, whether it was in Malaysia, the sultans would ask specifically, we want Punjabi soldiers. Hong Kong police force was Punjabi. Singapore police force, the Malaya police force was Punjabi. And you can see in the pecking order, the Gora in front, then the Sikhs, and then the locals. So there's a pecking order there. No way are you in front of this person, but you're there. And the reason I point this out is in Canada, I'm going to tell you, you are not here anymore. You are way back there. That pecking order has changed. And it's changed in Canada, and we'll talk why, about how and why. So this martial heritage, now that it's been lost, at the time was recognized to the extent that this is Shanghai police, okay, and they're mounted police. It's the same situation with the RCMP. The RCMP's heritage lies in this police force. So what we know to be the RCMP's musical ride, that was based on maneuvers that were made by the Khalsa army in the first Anglo-Sikh wars. What we know of their uniform to be the Sam Brown belt, that's actually Sam Brown of the Punjab Cavalry. It's a Punjabi heritage. So when identities are buried, when identities are distorted, you lose the history. So I wasn't here in the 1990s, but what I hear was that the basis for excluding the turban from the RCMP's uniform was that it was not a part of Canada's heritage. Well, they lied. Absolutely it was a part of the heritage. And unless you know all this history, you can't counter it. And that's what happened. That's why there was such a struggle. Now, there's one very interesting picture that we normally show at our exhibits, and that's of King George V wearing a turban. So if turbans weren't allowed into the Legion, for example, that picture would be, literally worth 1,000 words. So the heritage now, what it leads to is that not only is there an identity of being gallant, brave, which are universally admired, but there's also nobility now being assigned to that identity. So here, at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, in 1897 in London, you will see in the bottom right-hand corner a group of gentlemen there, cavalry, and they're all Punjabi cavalry. And they are the Honour Guard. Queen Victoria is in this. This is the biggest gathering at that time on the planet. The longest reigning monarch, the most powerful monarch in history, and she chooses the Punjabis to be her Honour Guard. No South Africans, no Canadians, no New Zealanders, no Australians. Punjabi cavalry. The Honour Guard. Number one position, pole position, in the biggest event of the 19th century. And that kind of position was at the end of the 19th century. That was understood. So here, this is at the coronation a few years later, 5 years later. Now we're talking about 1903, when we're starting to the community is going to come to Canada. This is at the coronation, King Edward, and you can see the Canada Arch, and there are Punjabi soldiers on horseback. So empire is one structure with one crown. It's the same monarch. The King of India is the King of Canada. And in that system, right at the top, the Punjabis are given pride of position. So what happens now in 1903 when people who have this proud identity start to come to Canada? It's just a hop, skip and a jump now to come to Canada. West Coast. Punjabis start coming all along the West Coast. San Francisco, Vancouver. Some people are already down doing the Panama Canal and so forth. So some Punjabis are trekking northwards. But what happens in Canada when these people come? Well, they bring their proud identity with them. Here they are. Upstanding, proud citizens of empire wearing their campaign medals. That's Vancouver 1906. Upright. Their identity comes with them. To such an extent, in Canada, they are favoured for employment. There are employers who are the owners of sawmills. This one is in McRae's sawmill, and this is in US Coquitlam. They actually wanted only Sikhs, because they knew that the Sikh soldiers were hard-working, drilled, strong. So now you've got an identity that actually gives you employment. People are seeking you. Bang! What happens? You're starting to become a rival to whites now. You have an identity in Canada at that time. There's anti-Asian hostility, but the Sikhs have come, they're Asian, but their identity is rivaling whites. They're gallant, they're all noble. So what happens? The Gore don't want to give the jobs away. See, basically racism is about stripping people of dignity, economic opportunity, to preserve your power at the top. So the identity now wasn't working in Canada for what Canada was trying to do. It was trying to implement a white Canada. And therefore, the next act was to destroy the identity, to corrupt that identity. So that Punjabis would not be able to find employment professionally, or even in agriculture, which was the largest economic sector. And the whole point of immigration to Canada, the number one priority of immigration to Canada, the policy's objective was to really build up the vast open spaces. Right? So what you have here is that turn vast open regions into fertile grounds is a part of the objective of immigration. Now, has anyone not heard of the canal colonies in Punjab? You haven't heard of canal colonies? Okay. So at the end of towards the beginning of the 20th century, the British engineered canals in what today is called the Salt Ranges of West Punjab, and they moved Doaba families to take up farms and settlement to turn vast open regions of unworked land into agricultural land. So whole families were moved to West Punjab. That's when partition happens, you have so many Sikhs coming back the other way. They were actually moved, lots of them en masse. So there's a precedent for vast open lands being turned into productive lands. It's happened already. Punjabi farmers are already understood to be the best farmers in the world. So why is that a problem now in Canada? Because you're giving away 160 acres free to people. So if the Punjabis come here, they're already getting favoured jobs in sawmills. Now, if they adopt and avail themselves of the Homesteading Act, they would be getting 160 acres free from Manitoba all the way to the west coast. So certain people decided the best way to stop that is to stop them coming into the country. So that's what the Continuous Voyage Act was about. It was about keeping Punjabis out of the country because their identity was rivaling whites. Because the whites knew from 40 years of service that they're strong people, they're very adept at agriculture, they're very good in the services, they'll thrive here. Who has a similar identity to the Sikhs that came here and thrived? Who? Scots. 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 Their whole heritage. You can't divorce the Scots. Scots are everywhere. Education sector, everything. Military. The Scotsman and the Sikh was the same at one point in time. There's no difference. They were looked upon as a martial race with the same kind of attributes and the same standing. But look where they are today and where the community is in Canada. Identity. You had essentially the same martial heritage, same service. So what happened then? 1908, which everyone will know in the room, the Continuous Voyage Act came, and then the obviously Westminster didn't want to see this happening because they had their own requirements for Punjabis in the empire, because they are the army, they are the police. So Westminster basically said, don't do it. Don't do this Continuous Voyage Act. But the Canadian government took no notice. So what did the community do to fight back against this corruption of identity? And now these laws that were based on creating a negative identity as undesirable people to keep them out of the country, what do? Well, they appeal to Canadians. So one of the most famous, there's a publication, a book called Great Canadian Speeches, 100 Great Canadian Speeches. And in there you'll see Sundar Singh's speech from 1912. And he talks about our identity. We are the subjects of the same empire. We have fought and we have sacrificed. And so forth. And he's now trying to fight back this negative identity, this corruption of identity, that you're undesirable people and so forth. You can't, you're not going to be allowed here. We're going to find some leeway, a way to do it. He tries to appeal. And during that, if you read the account of that speech, during that speech, he receives a standing ovation 6 times. So his message is starting to get traction. It's starting to connect with Canadians. But as soon as he leaves the room, the message is lost because the media is back to its tricks and implementing government policy in terms of alienating the community, corrupting their identity, because that's what sells papers. So what happens? The next fight back for restoring a positive identity. The Komagata arrives. Why was it chartered? Did those people charter the boat? Did they charter the boat to come here to break a law because they wanted to come in as refugees? No, they did not want to come as refugees. The Punjabis were the only people in the empire from India that were able to pay for their own tickets and come as free men. They were not indentured labourers. So they paid for their tickets and they said, you know what? That court, that legal system, the sense of fair play, we're going to use that to our advantage. We're going to use the courts to establish our identity. The one that the government is trying to distort and the media is using to dehumanize, and so therefore people do not support the case of the Punjabis in Canada. So they come. But we know what happened. We know that's the history. We know that the BC government basically said, you are undesirables. And off you go. At gunpoint. So, Kitchener's identity, which was of priceless value, was corrupted by the Canadian government to become one that's worthless to Canada. Undesirable to Canada. So that's how I think about government. And no one says it better than H.H. Stevens. I say this civilization is unproductive to the good of the human race as a whole. Now I will tell you something that probably no one has ever told you before. H.H. Stevens knew about the canal colonies. He knew about the martial heritage of the Sikhs because he tried to be a Canadian soldier in the Boer War, couldn't do it, and he ended up in 1900 in China, where he saw the 1st Sikh Infantry, the Punjab Frontier Force, outcompete every other nation and became top soldiers when they rescued the British delegation in Beijing when it was under siege. You won't know this history, but a film was made about this in the 1960s. You know the most epic films that were made ever on cinema in Hollywood? They were made in the 1960s. And the man that would always be in them would be Charlton Heston. Epic movie. It's called 55 Days in Peking, and the Sikhs are shown there, saving everyone. They outperformed the American Marines, they outperformed the British soldiers, they outperformed the Japanese soldiers, they outperformed the French, they outperformed the Germans. And that's what happens. There's an identity there. We won't have time to talk about that today. But, so we see that all the rights and that they wanted to deny the community in terms of jobs and so forth were based on a distortion of identity, that you are unproductive, undesirable, you should not be here, we don't want you here. So really what happens is that what was loyalty and citizenship. So we know that if you commit an extreme act of treachery, you can lose your citizenship. What treachery did this community commit to lose their citizenship, to lose their vote in 1907? Nothing. So this corruption then leads to the preferred countries, because you don't let 376 people in, but you let 400,000 Europeans in, and yet you say there's a problem in the job market. Yes, that's the issue, isn't it? That's not the case. That was all fabricated. If you've really got a problem in the job market, and Mackenzie King is the Labour Minister, and he says, well, we need to protect the jobs in BC, that's why we need to keep these people out. Well, why are 400,000 Europeans coming into the country in that year? And actually it's an interesting number because we still haven't approached 400,000 in a year. We're getting close in terms of immigration, but 400, it was a record, and it happened to be in 1913, 1914, at the time of the Kerma-Gatchamru. 376 people, not allowed in. 400,000 whites, welcome. From these countries, red carpet. Yet the people that were part of the heritage of the country, the British Empire, are not allowed in. So, that's your government. The government distorted your identity to keep your community out of Canada for decades. That's the start of that vicious cycle. Who creates that vicious cycle? Next is the heritage sector. When we are a multicultural country, as we said, the laws are in place, but when your children go to museums, do they see their pictures in museums? They go on a day trip, they come home, and they've learned about more white people. That must have been interesting. No one's going to engage with that. That goes on till today. So heritage now, the heritage sector, which is responsible for multiculturalism, is propping up these old, distorted identities, corrupted identities, by virtue of not addressing them. Education sector, schools, they're propping up the vicious cycle. It's a Eurocentric curriculum. And this is what my project is about. It's about changing that narrative, breaking the narrative of white dominance, that we did everything, we want all freedom, democracies, we did all of this, teaching children only that, exclusively that, and we break it and say, no, without the Punjabis you couldn't have done any of it. So that's the education sector. Media is the biggest culprit. Media since day one is basically the channel to the mainstream. And they're the ones that have done untold damage and have basically put the community on a negative trajectory as far as I'm concerned. Because they have consistently denied the positive identity. They've propagated a negative identity. Each time they publish a newspaper and it says the ethnicity of the criminal, when it's a visible minority, they're endorsing white is right. And no studies have been done. This is not anecdotal. This is not me just telling you a story. This is, you look through the papers, you analyze the text, and not even majority, nearly 100% of the cases are that in the first paragraph of a news story, if it's a visible minority performing a criminal act, you will know about their ethnicity. But if it's whites, no. So the media has been part of that consistent denial of a positive identity, stereotyping and miscasting. So why is that such an issue? Because people might know you might have neighbors, they know who you are, and they might know you as good people. But there's a huge country out there that doesn't actually know Sikhs, Punjabis, South Asians, and their only way of knowing who these people are is what they see in the media. That's the first time that they encounter that visage, that persona. And I'm telling you now, for decades it's been negative. And we know why, because they're basically selling their ideologies, the ideology of the government and the majority, because that's how they sell to the majority. Doesn't make good news. We know this for a fact because when we do positive identity events, no media comes to them. But yet in Surrey, if one of our kids does something wrong, there's media all over it. So we see this playing out. These are current issues. These are issues today. So, as I said, the textual analysis will show you that there's overwhelming evidence to say that it's biased reporting. So, going back in history, to know why they did this, here's a newspaper from 1902. So it's before that 1903 where it starts happening. At that time, that positive identity, remember the first Prime Minister of Canada had a positive opinion of Sikhs? Well, in 1902, this is the front page of the province. Turban men excite interest. It's a positive news story in 1902. Because at this moment in time, we don't have the government saying we need to keep these people out so they don't take the free land, so they don't take our jobs. So that is not going on. Right now, Canada, the early days of BC were very multicultural. There was a biracial governor at one point. So there's no issue. Turbans excite interest. Positive news story. But then it all changes after that. And one of the most egregious ones that I have come across is when the media is saying, oh, these people are unhealthy, unhygienic, undesirable, they're deviants. They actually, the authorities commission a surgeon to actually inspect the Punjabi passengers coming to Vancouver. So the ship, I think it was, Monteagle, it lands in Victoria, and a surgeon who's pro-white, hired by the pro-white lobby, examines these people, and his mandate was to define that they are unhealthy and undesirable. They carry diseases. In fact, what does he do? He goes on record, and this was published in the Times Colonist newspaper. He basically says that I refer in particular to the Sikhs, and I am not exaggerating in the least when I say that they were 100% cleaner in their habits and freer from disease than the European steerage passengers I had come into contact with. So the facts and what the media is portraying and what the government is implementing in policy are totally misaligned. So why is that? Where is that identity now? This is the bit that gets me, and why I did the project, is that, well, now you have words like gangster and terrorist. But what strikes me is that the venom with which these things are used and the basis on which they're used, because they are the very antithesis of hero. They're antisocial. Terrorists and gangster are destructive to society. The same things being used 100 years ago, instead, and they're the other polar extreme, on the other end of the virtues spectrum. So instead of hero, gangster, terrorist. So this is a cycle of 100 years. It's complete. If we think about Aboriginals being dehumanized, we think about the black community being dehumanized, how is it not the same case with the Punjabis when their kids die on the streets and there's apathy? No one cares. Is that not dehumanization? It doesn't happen overnight. It's been at play for 100 years. So, remember the story of unhygienic, horrible, unsavory, deviant people? Well, look at this one. Where does the word vermin come into it? This country with his kind of vermin. It takes a very special type of thinking to have the word vermin come out of your mouth when describing people. That's the connection you have with a history of being dehumanized to the extent that at the beginning, so this is some of the stuff from the early 20th century. One commentator of the period described India as a hotbed of the most virulent and loathsome diseases. Bubonic plague, smallpox, cholera, venereal diseases, all these were the labels that were attached to the Punjabi community. That's how you get words like vermin in the vernacular to describe a person. So, where did this all come from? From having a negative identity. So, how do you combat it? It's not going to be easy. But the first thing is, you work to create, promote, publicize a positive identity. And the positive identity is one based on virtues that people share. I don't like to say I have negative virtues. I like to say that I have positive virtues. So if you and me have the same virtues, you're positive. The whole basis of negative identity was that your virtues, your characteristics, your values were negative. So that's what creates the virtuous cycle. Because when you do that, you create positive dialogues, that creates respect. This is my personal experience on our project, and I'll show you this in a moment. That when we talk about the positive identity of the Sikhs in a heroic terms, we encounter positive dialogues. And we actually get talking, we have respectful dialogues. To the point that people, once they know this history, have even said to me, we shouldn't have done the Komagata Muru. Did anyone say that after the Prime Minister apologised? We shouldn't have done the Komagata Muru? No. They didn't, because they don't understand the context of the apology, why the apology was made. So, just by giving an apology at government level, so government still hasn't done its job, doesn't create a positive identity. It can actually make things worse. I'll touch on that as well in a moment. So, once you do that, you get pro-social views instead of anti-social views. And then, you've got a little bit of trust going on. And that's a virtuous circle. That unity and diversity is a slogan that's disgusting. Cheap shot. Because you can't have unity unless you respect people. Without respect, there is no unity. Without trust, there is no unity. So just plastering this all over the place, saying Canada is a leading multicultural country, there's unity and diversity here, this is what it's about, that's rubbish. Kids dying on the streets, no one cares. No one wants to give resources to sort those problems out, because let them die. Because? Why? Live by the sword, die by the sword. Those are those kind of people with negative qualities. That's what they want to do, be hoodlums, let them die. That's apathy. Bordering on intolerance and then hostility. So, tell stories to teach character, parables. What have we been doing since time immemorial as human beings? We've been telling stories to teach character. All the fables you learn at school, they're all about character building. Aesops. Yeah? Which is the biggest story gone untold in the Punjabi community? It's the First World War. The reason being, it's the one that changed the history. That war was so big that its ripples affect us today in the 21st century. It was the cause of the Second World War. So it's even bigger than the Second World War. It's the number one geopolitical event in mankind's history. And it would have all been different if the Punjabis hadn't done what they did, which is served and saved the Western world. So that's the biggest untold story. So that's why we do this project. It's not about imperialism. I'm creating a positive dialogue of respect. I'm not going to do that by throwing stones at people. That's what we should have learnt by now. Throwing stones doesn't get, you know the saying, people and sugar rather than vinegar. Yeah? So we need to create positive identities. And so if you think about it, the policy and practice of multiculturalism are different in practice. And diversity is going to need that work. So with that, I'll finish. I won't talk about that missing history, how you actually do it, the methodology. But you'll have to come to one of our exhibits and learn that. But just know one thing, that if the Punjabis hadn't gone to war, they'd be speaking German in Canada as well, because the German community was the third largest. It was after the British and the French, it was the Germans. So the French and the British were defeated. You'd be speaking German in Canada as well. And at the time it was understood how much India was owed. The British PM actually said it in 1918. If you want me to carry on, I've still got 2 minutes.
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, you want me to carry on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the best part of all of this is that the number one quality, as far as I'm concerned, as a trait, as a virtue, is integrity. I don't think anyone in the world would say, oh, integrity is a bad thing to have. What was the biggest act of integrity that any community has done that changed the outcome of the world? It was to fight in the First World War. Because we know that the events of the Komagata-Maru, with people being thrown out, we know that they've got racist policies. So it wasn't the easiest thing to do then to say is, we're not going to fight for you, we're not going to go to war, because you treat us badly in Canada. That was the easiest thing to do. This was the argument playing out in Punjab in 1914. While the Komagata-Maru is going back to India, should we or shouldn't we fight for the British Empire? Sikhs must now unsheathe their swords. Enemies of government denounce Sikhs for serving in the army on a paltry pay, right? So these are the radicals, the Gadar and so forth. So there's two opposing views. Which one? The one, if you look here, it says at the top one, let's forget about the ill treatment of Sikhs in Canada and the unpleasant speeches made about Sikhs in Canada. What is that? That is saying, let's put our differences aside, let's not break our word, let's not prove them right. We have taken an oath to serve. If we can't be trusted with our word, if your word is, you cannot rely on someone's word, is that a positive thing or a negative thing? So the greatest act of integrity is when you have to do the right thing when it's the most difficult thing. Doing the right thing when it's easy, there's no measure of character. There's no test of character. The Sikhs were in a pressure cooker situation. In Canada, they're being hounded, thrown out, being called vermin, being told they have venereal diseases. Yet they hold the power. So that's the other attribute of honor and integrity. If you have the power to make a difference, you could have stepped away and it would have been the defeat of the empire. You had the power. Why did they have the power? Well, they had the power because when war broke out, nearly half of the British army was infantry, was Punjabi. Nearly 2/3 of the British army was cavalry, was Punjabi. And more than 80% of the artillery of the British army in India was Punjabi. In other words, if the Punjabis didn't go to war, they haven't got much of an army left to stop the Germans. And the war would have been over by Christmas 1914, because that's what everyone thought. And that's why everyone rushed, even the kids rushed to sign on. Let's go to war, get the acclaim, get the fame that we went to serve, because the war's going to be over soon. Because Schlieffen had a plan to take Paris in 42 days. So then Punjabis fought in Flanders Fields at Canada's moment of its birth, stood by Canada, even though it was easy to say, well, you treated us bad, we're going to step aside. Go ahead, guys, fight your own battle, we're not going to protect you. But the Sikhs said, no, you have called us for help, and we will protect you. Are these not the fundamental tenets of Sikhism? Are these not the stories that should be told? At that point, at the most important pivot point of the history of Canada, its formation on the Western Front, its history of Vimy, its birth on the Western Front. They talk about this all day long. They would have lost that battle if the Sikhs hadn't done their heroics. And they understood this at that time. They said that few battalions in His Majesty's army can show a higher percentage of losses throughout its service in France than this fine corps, which so worthily upheld the traditions of the Khalsa, British press, positive identity. So, in Canada, they had undergone character assassination, had been slandered just 2 years before, 3 years before, 5 years before, and what do? They proved them wrong, and they fought back for their identity. So, in fact, what happened was that it was understood, and that act of Punjabis going to war, even though they were being treated so badly, was understood, and it was called one of the greatest events in mankind's history. Not in military history, in the history of mankind. Why? Because it was such an act of integrity that you didn't break your word when you had the power to change everything. You would have got us into trouble. But you said, no, I will do the hard thing and we will do it, and you laid down your lives. And people understood this. This was at the Imperial War Cabinet. Borden was sitting in on this conversation. The Prime Minister of Canada heard this. Yet he didn't come back and restore the vote, which is what he was being lobbied for. The argument in the Imperial War Cabinet was this, that we have served, we have sacrificed, give us our vote back. Again, Canadian government didn't do it. So, that's why the military history is important to understand and to be aware of. Because it refutes the negative identity. It calls out the government for what it's been doing, systematically, decade after decade after decade. And when they celebrate Vimy, which is here, and they celebrate the first battle at Flanders, that's here, right in the middle is the memorial to Indian soldiers. Right in the middle. Same space, same battles were fought. Punjabis fought with Canada in its first battle. Punjabis fought with Canada in its second battle. Punjabis fought with Canada at Vimy. Punjabis flew over the third battle of East, Passchendaele. They were there. There was a pilot in the sky, a Sikh pilot. The reason I bring him up is that he is the man that came in 1947 when India had been given independence and said, I am now the ambassador. He was made ambassador of India to Canada. He arrived in Canada and said, remember that fight we flew together, that battle we flew together? And the guy looked at him. It was Pearson. I think Pearson is one of the early... It was Pearson. The foreign secretary, which is the equivalent of what in Canada? Who's the foreign secretary in Canada? Position. You guys... Foreign minister. Okay, the foreign minister, right? Yeah. Freeland. Today's the equivalent of Freeland. When the first ambassador of a free India came to Canada, met Freeland and looked at the person and said, hey, you and I, we flew planes together, we fought the Red Baron together, they had flown together. They were the same soldiers, they were both RAF pilots. And they hugged and he said, I want my vote. And the other soldier turned around and said, I'll give you the vote of the Indian people. So that's the power of military heritage. That's the power of history. That even the vote that should have been given in 1921, in 1920, 1919, wasn't given. All Borden did was say, okay, you guys can have your families join you. But he should have given citizenship. That didn't happen until later on. So it's a huge, important story. And we could talk about it for hours, but my time is up. I just want to let you know.
You can question if anybody has
Yeah, just want to let you know. Positive dialogues ensue from that. Any questions?
Yeah, Steve, do you have a list of books?
Recommended reading?
Yeah.
I will be in the back of the book that we're publishing. Recommended reading will be in there.
How would you pass on to us?
You're sponsoring the book. You'll have hundreds of copies
Oh,
of
I
the book.
see. Okay. Sriram Singh ji,
There'll be a bibliography.
other day, Kirpal Singh Garcha, उसने 100 किताबां.
We already decided.
Okay.
So,
Sorry, can you tell us more about the book? I didn't know.
so what we've done is to mark the 100th anniversary of the first Remembrance Day. So the first Remembrance Day was made to remember the First World War. So this is the 100th Remembrance Day. It's actually the biggest Remembrance Day in our, in our lifetimes. We are releasing a commemorative book of our exhibit, and in there, all these stories that I've been talking about are in there. And what I've asked is community groups to sponsor the book, so then what I can do is give books back to the community, and then you take those books, you give them to the children, and tell the children to go and give them to the teachers, you give them to your white neighbors, you give them to your libraries, and put it out there. And demand that education changes. Yeah?
Why are we not asking for these books to be taught in the curriculum? Is that something that you're thinking?
I'm not thinking. I was within this much of getting it all done, but then there was a change of government locally. Eventually.
But you should talk to Ravi.
Doesn't work. A lot of partisan politics. We won't discuss that. I have to stay quiet. Basically, we did that. We've created curriculum resources, and unfortunately, I haven't in the last nearly a year been able to speak to the education minister, so we haven't been able to put it into the curriculum. And I'm waiting for the education minister to give me a call back, and we will be able to put it in. It's 80% complete. We have lessons, we have teachers' resources, and so forth.
Those are the very important sources needed by the teachers in the schools.
100%. Because the teachers, when they get the resources, a lot of them are very happy because they have a classroom of, a diverse classroom. They don't even know how to start. You give them these resources and they're very thankful. And we already have the results that when they speak about this in class, the teachers will categorically say the students respond. So much that some teachers have told us that there are boys in the classroom in social studies that have never spoken to them, to the teacher. But when you talk about this, they'll come back the next day, and they've either gone back and said, Sada Baba we jang gaya siga. And they'll go and they'll speak to their families, and they'll find out, and then come back and they tell the teacher the next day. And the teachers have told us that's sometimes the first time one of our students has even spoken to us, because our boys do not study socials. They're the worst performing at socials.
One thing is clear from this page, that value and loyalty have made our identity, according to all these sketches.
Yes. It's the basis for coming to this country.
But what is the value they have taken it at the end, when there was a partition? Are they regulated these factors at that time?
No.
What they have valued for our contributions?
The values for the contributions were swept away in Jallianwala Bagh, straight away. Why do you have to wait until 1947? Why did Jallianwala Bagh happen? That's what I'm saying. The identity, the value of all of this. The community has been robbed. Dignity is an asset. Dignity has been robbed in Canada, across the world. The identity is not like that. Yes, that you are priceless assets, you've done this. Without you, the democracy that we have would be different. I'm not saying the Germans would introduce something else, but I'm just saying it would be different. So, no, you're absolutely right, but you don't even have to look at 1947, that's the whole thing, that the value hasn't been given to the community. And what that means is now it's affecting youth, because when you don't feel that you belong, that you don't see that you are running the country, you are not in every position of captain, you're not captains of industry, you don't see yourselves on TV being stars and being lionized in heroic roles. When you don't see that, you just say, well, society's got nothing for me. And when that happens, because unfortunately our kids are not studying very hard, our boys are not studying very hard, when that happens, then Putirkan come into play.
Yeah. But media, as you mentioned in your presentation, media has a big role But
Biggest
so,
role.
Yeah, but so far, as we are seeing every day, the same trend which we 100 years ago, and it was really, that things is still not changed the way it should be. And what we can do back then,
Well, so the biggest, the rest of our presentation normally goes on to what the other things that we are doing. And we can try and tackle heritage, we can try and tackle education by creating curriculum pieces. But the biggest problem is this 100 years of negative identity which the media has put into the popular culture. That's very hard to dislodge. Very, very hard. So there are ways to do it. Number one, who knows who William Wallace is in this room? Why? Because you watched a heroic film about Scots. Do we have a heroic film about the Punjabi saving the world? That everyone watches? No, see, in heritage, that's not general public. If we create an exhibit, the person that goes to the museum is not general public, it's interested public. They must want to see the exhibit. So, how do we educate general public? The biggest platform is, unless we own mainstream newspapers, the biggest platform is film. That's what everyone goes to see. Not students, that's not general public. You're forced to learn from a textbook. Not people going to museums because I'm cultured. But the general person on the street, that's how they get their education about history. Any other questions? My time is up.
I have a question, but it's not toward you. It's the organizers of this meeting. Why in just a small room? Why not in a big place where more people could come and...
For this lecture?
Yes.
Oh, there's so many reasons. Number one is we have so many politics in our community, which we know, there's no hiding that, that's why we've never progressed. So I will show you how bad it is.
I'm really appreciating in the creek, because him and his wife mentioned it to their parents and they mentioned it to me because I do have interest in it, you know.
But here's the problem. We're so fractured as a community that we allow partisan politics to get in the way. So the reason we don't have big rooms listening to this is that there will be a group of people who will say, you know what, I only see the Gadar story. I only believe in Mewar Singh as the only hero. So these guys, I don't want to learn about these guys, right? These are traitors. So that's a huge part of the establishment. So the biggest challenge I had when I started this project, I already knew, I went to see Mr. Sadhu Vining. I spoke to him for 4 hours before I started the project. I said, I know what my problem is going to be, but I'm still going to do it. I said, you can do what you guys, do what you like, say what you like, call me imperialist, whatever you want. But 500,000 Punjabis went to war and each one was brave like Mewar Singh. Why should we throw those people under the bus? Yeah? So people don't want to hear it because after 1947 in India, people called these people traitors because they're a republic. So even the regiments had to get rid of their honours. So they dishonored those. So that's from India. You will never learn about Sikh heroes. So the identity is gone. In Canada, you don't want to learn about this because we only know Komagata Maru as a victimology. And we only know about Gadar. We don't know, and we know about Mewar Singh. We don't know about these guys, but they're fighting for the British. How stupid can these people be? What are they, cattle? The moment you start to think that way, you are saying that our forefathers had no agency, that they didn't have this, that they couldn't weigh things up and decide. Is there anybody in this room that will say to me that if 5 Gores are standing and causing a Punjabi man a problem, the Punjabi man will turn around and hide? Punjabi man won't do that. Punjabi man will stand up and he'll fight more than any other Indian. So why couldn't the Indian soldiers just fight a handful of Gore? Because they didn't want to. Because the system was working for a minority. Remember, Punjabi Sikhs were a minority. Even today, they're a minority in India, and look what's happening. And the British empowered them. They gave them the plum jobs. For them, the system worked. The crops, the land prices. The reason you could hire, you could commission the Komagata You could buy the tickets to come to Canada. The reason, because your land was worth so much money. Why was it? Because the canals are all working. Because the system was working. The crops were now in an international marketplace. People don't want to hear it. They just believe in victimologies. But unfortunately, that victimology belongs to 99% of other Indian communities and does not belong to the community in this room. So when the Bengali professor writes all this rubbish about, oh, the British did this and did that. Yes, the British did that to the Bengalis, not to the Punjabis. And is the Bengali my friend that I should stick with him? No, he isn't. The first thing that I did when I got the Simon Fraser University to become our partner in this was I went and I said, they agreed this history has to be told, all right? And they said, we don't have any military professors. We're going to get a historian. Maybe that historian can work with you. And I said, yeah, I'm willing to work with any historian as long as it's not Bengali.
How about Mr. Puni?
Yeah, I'll work with anyone. But I'm just saying, I said, as long as it's not Bengali.
Yeah.
And they asked me why. The Dean of Humanities at Simon Fraser University said, why do you say that, Steve? Why would you work with anyone other than Bengali? And he's a Scotsman. I said, would you like your history, you're a Scotsman, for a Sicilian to write about who you are, what your values are, and what you did? Would you have a Sicilian do it? So why should a Punjabi have a Bengali write about their culture, their history, what they are, what their values were, why they went to war, right? So then I explained to him one way, which really cut through to it. I said, what is the biggest unifying force on the planet right now that brings people together? What is it? It's the Ummah of Islam. When you are in Islam and you believe in the Ummah, it doesn't matter if you're Syrian, Pakistani, doesn't matter if you're Somalian, you come together like this. And I said, in that force, one group of people didn't stick to it. That's the Bengalis and the Punjabis. They hate each other that much that East Pakistan and West Pakistan couldn't function, even though they're Muslim. Why? Because Punjabis and Bengalis are chalk and cheese. And he said, go ahead, Steve, write your whole history, whatever you want to write. You're right. The problem is you have been fed rubbish by the Indian government. You've had your identity distorted by the Canadian government and the British government, and you don't even know your own history. And the Bengali is not going to tell you your great virtues, because they're not interested in it. They're interested in their virtues. And unfortunately, all of academia in India is run by Bengali professors. Everywhere. And sure enough, the professor that came to SFU she's Bengali. And so was the professor. So when so the same thing happened at the National War Museum in Ottawa. That's the national stage. And they invited me to speak, and I said, I'm glad you invited me to speak, because I would have forced the issue, because I know there's a Bengali professor coming from England who's written 14 books on World War I. He's a King's College graduate, he's at Cambridge, he's an English professor, and I guarantee the moment he goes on that stage, he is going to denigrate the Punjabis. He's going to suggest the Punjabis are cattle, they had their arms twisted and went into war, because I know, because I've read his books and I've read his newspaper articles, and that's all they do for 20 years. And then I said, the cherry on the top of his lecture is going to be, he's going to talk about his one uncle, grand uncle that was in the army, and he's going to spend 25 minutes that you're going to give him on the biggest platform in the country to talk about military heritage, and he's going to talk about his one uncle that was in it, and then how Punjabis were forced to go to war. Exactly that's what he did. But they gave me a chance. And I spoke of Izzat. And we destroyed him. And no one wanted to speak to that man again. And everyone said, this is the history. So the power of history comes only into play when we recognize it. We ourselves have thrown this history away. It's very powerful history. When a person of Gora says to you, we shouldn't have done the Komagata Maru, the apology did not get that answer. The word racism is not used in the Komagata Maru apology. What is racism? Racism is stripping away a person's dignity so that someone else is more dignified. Stripping away their economic ability so someone else is more successful and monopolizes economic means. So all these things, even the apology given by the Prime Minister, is a sham, because the word racism is not in there. Until we raise these things, we can't confront them. So going back to your answer, to answer your question, why we have done stuff. The biggest platform, as I said, the National War Museum is the biggest lecture you can give in military heritage. So we have done it, but the audience was all Gore. Few people came locally. Because in Canada, this is not a history that people want to hear. But does that mean that I will not give the history? Of course I'm going to give it. Because I kind of have a different idea and I can connect the dots. So unfortunately, people in Canada have never, because I was born in the UK, raised in the UK, I have a kind of different outlook. I saw different things. I see where the dots are, I see how to connect them. If we don't see the dots, we can't connect them. And unfortunately in Canada, that's been the problem. We're only educated in a certain way. So if there's any other questions, I better go because my time is up.
Yeah, one more question. Will you be going for some interviews? Yes, Mr. Kuldeep Singh from Radio KRPI and myself with Joy TV.
We've already been speaking.
Okay.
They know
I'm
me
with
inside
Joy
out.
TV.
They know.
I'm just wondering if you can spare some time for the interviews.
Yeah, the best time to do it will be for remembrance, why our community should.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. One of the first things that Gora said to me in this country when I was talking about the war was, what have Punjabis got to do with the war? What have Indo-Canadians got to do with the war? World War I. He said, I've never seen Indo-Canadians wear poppies. He actually told me this story, I remember it. And the man has written 5 books, heritage books. His wife ran the Surrey Museum. He himself ran several museums. A heritage professional in the Lower Mainland, Gora, and says to me, I remember sitting outside some store called Eaton's. I wasn't even in Canada when Eaton's was around. He goes, I remember sitting outside Eaton's one time and I watched these Indo-Canadians go by the Legion people and they didn't buy any poppies. They don't wear poppies. They don't do anything. I said, well, you know what you did in the Legion, don't you? You disrespected, yeah, our identity. That's number one. That's why you don't see kids, because there's nothing that everyone talks to about. So last year what happened was, the school in Surrey where we work really closely, the kids themselves, not us, the kids themselves created a social media campaign called #The Poppy Belongs to All of Us. So we're going to change it. The kids are doing it. So these Gore, they wear their poppies and they think they're all, oh, we've done all of this, and they feel really self-important. Well, every Punjabi has more right to wear the poppy because the Punjabis were in Flanders fields 5 months before the Canadians were there. Come on. All Punjabis should be wearing poppies. Imagine that, every Punjabi wearing poppies. What would they say then? How will they feel more important? They can't feel more important because now you're equal. So you give them a free ride by not knowing this history. Okay?
Thank you.
All right.